Clara was adopted by a wealthy family, but once they had their own child, her life turned into a nightmare. Forced to marry a man she barely knew, Clara believed her dreams were shattered until she discovered the truth about her husband. What happened next left her cruel adoptive parents in deep regret. Clara was only 4 years old when Thomas and Margaret adopted her. She had spent her early years in an orphanage, surrounded by other children who, like her, had no parents. She often dreamed of having a real family, one that would love her, care for her, and make her feel like she belonged. So when Thomas and Margaret came to the orphanage one day and chose her, Clara felt like the luckiest girl in the world. From the moment Clara stepped into their grand, beautiful home, she felt safe and cherished. Thomas and Margaret treated her like their own daughter. They bought her pretty dresses, new toys, and even a small stuffed bunny that Clara held close every night as she fell asleep. Every morning, Margaret would wake her with a gentle kiss on the forehead and help her get ready for the day. Clara would run to the dining table, where a warm breakfast was always waiting: pancakes with syrup, scrambled eggs, and fresh juice. She loved every bite. At mealtimes, she sat between Thomas and Margaret, laughing as they talked about their day. Thomas would sometimes lift her high into the air, making her giggle as he spun her around. "You're my little princess, Clara," he would say, and her heart would swell with joy. Margaret, on the other hand, loved brushing Clara's long, silky hair. She would sit her down on a soft chair and gently run a comb through her locks. "You're such a beautiful girl," Margaret would whisper with a smile. Clara felt special and loved. They took her to the park on weekends, where she played on the swings and chased butterflies in the garden. She especially loved it when Thomas and Margaret took her to the ice cream shop, letting her pick any flavor she wanted. She always chose strawberry, and Thomas would pretend to steal a bite, making her laugh. At bedtime, Margaret would read her stories about princes, princesses, and magical lands. Clara would close her eyes, dreaming of castles, fairies, and a life filled with love and happiness. She believed she had finally found her forever family. But what Clara didn't know was that everything was about to change. Margaret became pregnant. At first, Clara was thrilled. "You're going to have a little sister or brother," Margaret told her with a big smile. Clara clapped her hands and jumped up and down. She imagined all the fun they would have together, playing with dolls, sharing stories, and running through the house. But as Margaret's belly grew, things slowly started to change. Margaret no longer had time to brush Clara's hair or read her bedtime stories. Thomas no longer spun her around in the air or called her his little princess. Instead, they were busy preparing for the new baby. The warm hugs and loving words became fewer and fewer. One day, Clara asked, "Mommy, can we go get ice cream today?" Margaret, who was folding baby clothes, sighed. "Not today, Clara. I'm too tired." Clara's heart sank, but she nodded quietly. She understood that the baby was important, but she missed how things used to be. At night, she still hugged her stuffed bunny, but now she felt a little lonely. The bedtime stories stopped, and she had to put herself to sleep. The warm, happy feeling she once had was slowly fading. Even though Thomas and Margaret still smiled at her sometimes, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. She just didn't know how much her life was about to change. And then one day, Emily was born. At first, Clara was excited to have a little sister. She wanted to help take care of Emily, but her parents didn't let her. They said Emily was too special to be touched by her. That was the first time Clara realized she was different. As Emily grew, so did the unfairness in the house. Clara wasn't treated like a daughter anymore, she was treated like a servant. Before Emily was born, Clara's mornings were filled with hugs and kind words. Now, they were filled with chores. She had to wake up before everyone else to clean the entire house. She scrubbed the floors until her hands hurt, washed the dishes even if she hadn't eaten, and dusted every corner while Emily sat and played. "Make sure the house is spotless before breakfast," Margaret would say. But Clara was never allowed to sit at the table with them. She had to wait until everyone finished eating before she could have whatever was left. Sometimes, there was nothing. One morning, Clara smelled fresh pancakes. She was so hungry, and her stomach growled. She reached for a small piece, but before she could take a bite, Margaret grabbed her hand. "Thieves don't belong in this house," she snapped. "If you want food, finish your chores first." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. She knew arguing would only make things worse. Emily had the best of everything. She had soft dresses made of silk and pretty shoes that sparkled. Her toys filled the whole room: dolls, stuffed animals, and big castles. Clara, on the other hand, wore old clothes that didn't fit and had holes in them. Her shoes were so worn out that her toes peeked through. When she asked for new ones, Thomas shook his head. "We only buy nice things for our real daughter," he said. One day, Emily broke her expensive doll and cried loudly. Margaret rushed to her side, hugging and kissing her. "Don't cry, my darling. We'll buy you 10 more, she promised. Clara watched quietly. She had never been hugged like that. When her own doll broke a few months ago, she had begged for a new one. "Dolls are for special girls, not useless ones," Margaret had said. Clara never asked for anything again. Clara was not allowed to play with Emily. Emily would sit on the couch, watching cartoons while Clara scrubbed the floor nearby. One afternoon, Emily dropped her toy. Clara picked it up and handed it to her. "Mom," Emily screamed. "She touched my toy." Margaret stormed into the room. "Don't ever touch Emily's things again," she scolded Clara. "Go clean in the bathroom." That night, Clara lay in her small, cold room, staring at the ceiling. She wondered why her parents stopped loving her. Thomas and Margaret always believed Emily over Clara, even when she was innocent. One day, Emily spilled juice on the carpet. She gasped and looked at Clara. Then, with a sly smile, she yelled, "Mom, Clara made a mess." Margaret rushed in and saw the stain. She didn't even ask what happened. She just grabbed Clara's arm and dragged her to the kitchen. "No dinner for you tonight," she said. Clara's stomach growled, but she just nodded. She knew it didn't matter what she said. When Emily turned 10, Thomas and Margaret threw a huge party. There were balloons, a giant cake, and lots of presents. Clara watched from the kitchen as Emily laughed with her friends. She wasn't allowed to join. A week later, Clara turned 15. She didn't expect much, but she still hoped for a small cake or even just a happy birthday. But the day passed like any other. She cleaned the house, served food, and watched as Emily played. No one even said her name. That night, she whispered to herself, "Happy birthday, Clara," before crying herself to sleep. Years passed, and Clara's life remained the same. She was always working, always hungry, and always alone. Thomas and Margaret didn't see her as a daughter anymore, just a burden. But Clara still had dreams. She wanted to go to college, to build a life where she was loved and respected. Little did she know, her parents had different plans for her, plans that would change her life forever. Clara sat on the cold floor of her small room, her heart pounding like a drum. Her hands trembled as she held the old dress Thomas and Margaret had given her to wear for the wedding. It wasn't new, nor was it special, just something they found in the back of the closet. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she thought about her life. She had always dreamed of going to school, getting a degree, and becoming someone important. But now, all those dreams were being taken away. Thomas and Margaret had decided that Clara would marry Edward, a poor man from the village. They never asked her what she wanted. They never cared about her feelings. "You should be grateful we even raised you," Margaret had told her that morning. "Now do as we say and stop acting like a spoiled child." Clara wasn't spoiled. She had spent her whole life serving them. She was the one who cleaned the house, cooked the meals, and washed the dishes. And their real daughter never lifted a finger. Yet here she was, being forced to marry someone she barely knew, just because she wasn't their real child. The wedding wasn't a big event. There were no flowers, no decorations, no music. It was just a small, plain ceremony in the backyard. Clara stood in front of Edward, her eyes filled with unshed tears. He looked at her with kindness, but that didn't make her pain any less. She didn't know him. She didn't love him. But none of that mattered to Thomas and Margaret. As the priest spoke, Clara felt like the walls were closing in. Her hands shook as she placed them in Edward's. When it was time to say, "I do," her voice cracked. She wanted to run away, to scream, to beg someone to stop this. But she knew no one would. Thomas and Margaret stood at the side, watching with smug smiles. To them, this was a perfect ending. Clara was no longer their problem. Once the ceremony was over, Margaret clapped her hands together and said, "Well, that's done. Now pack your things and leave. We don't have space for married women in this house." Clara's heart broke into a million pieces. She had lived in that house since she was 4 years old. She had given them everything: her love, her obedience, her hard work. And yet, they were throwing her out like garbage. Emily giggled beside her mother, whispering something into her ear. They both laughed. With a heavy heart, Clara gathered her few belongings: a small bag with some clothes and an old book she had kept hidden under her bed. She turned to look at the house one last time, but Thomas and Margaret had already walked away, not even sparing her a final glance. Edward held her hand gently as they walked away. He didn't say much, but there was a sadness in his eyes. Clara wanted to hate him, but she couldn't. He wasn't the one who had forced this marriage. Thomas and Margaret were. Still, that didn't change the fact that she was walking into a future she never wanted. As they left, Clara heard Margaret's voice behind her. "Let's see how she survives now. She thought she was something special. She's nothing without us." Tears streamed down Clara's face, but she kept walking. With each step, she felt the weight of her past pushing down on her. She had lost everything: her home, her dreams, her future. She didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: she was truly alone now. Clara held Edward's hand tightly as they stepped off the old, creaky bus. They had no idea where they were going, no money in their pockets, and nowhere to stay. The city was big and noisy, and people rushed past them without even noticing the sorrow in their eyes. Clara's heart felt heavy. She had never been on her own before. Even though Thomas and Margaret treated her badly, she at least had a roof over her head and food to eat. Now, she had nothing: just Edward, who was also struggling. They walked for hours, looking for a place to stay. The sun had already set when they finally found a small, broken-down house at the end of a quiet street. The walls had cracks, and the roof looked like it would fall at any moment. But they had no choice. With the little money Edward had saved, they rented the tiny house. It was dark, cold, and empty, but it was all they could afford. That night, Clara sat on the hard floor and hugged her knees. Her stomach growled loudly. They had not eaten the whole day. Edward looked at her with sad eyes. "I will find a way to take care of us," he whispered. But Clara could see how tired and hopeless he felt. The next morning, Edward left early to look for a job. He knocked on every shop and restaurant, but no one wanted to hire him. "We are not looking for workers right now," they would say, or "We need someone with experience." Edward had never worked before. He had grown up in a palace, living like a prince. He didn't know how to do anything except read books and ride horses. Meanwhile, Clara stayed at home, trying to clean the dirty little house. The dust made her sneeze, and her hands hurt from scrubbing the old wooden floor. She had never lived in such a terrible place before. There was no proper bed, no soft pillows, no warm meals waiting for her. Days passed, and Edward finally found a small job carrying heavy sacks in a market. The work was tough, and his hands got blisters, but he had no choice. He earned very little, just enough to buy a small loaf of bread and some water. Clara and Edward would sit on the floor and share the bread, eating slowly to make it last. Sometimes, they went to bed hungry because they had nothing left to eat. Clara's stomach ached at night, and tears rolled down her cheeks. She missed the days when she could at least eat a warm meal, even if she had to wait until everyone else had finished. But now, she had no one to cook for her. Winter came quickly, and the house was freezing cold. Wind entered through the cracks in the walls. Clara and Edward had only one thin blanket, so they huddled together to stay warm. Clara's hands and feet were always numb, and her lips turned pale from the cold. One night, it rained heavily. Water leaked through the broken roof, making the floor wet. Clara and Edward had to sit in a corner, trying to stay dry. "I don't know how much longer I can live like this," Clara whispered, tears filling her eyes. She had dreamed of getting a higher education, of having a good life. But now, she was stuck in this misery. Edward felt guilty. He had promised to take care of her, but he had failed. Every night, he lay awake, thinking of ways to make things better. He wanted to tell Clara the truth, that he was actually a prince. But he was afraid. What if she treated him differently? What if she only stayed with him because of his wealth? He needed to be sure that she loved him for who he truly was. One day, Edward came home with a bright smile. "Clara, I found a better job," he said, his eyes filled with excitement. He had met a kind shopkeeper who needed someone to help sell clothes. The pay was still small, but it was more than what he earned at the market. Clara felt a little hopeful. Slowly, things started to get better. They could afford to buy more food, and Clara even managed to get some second-hand clothes to wear. Though life was still tough, they had each other, and that was all that mattered. Little did Clara know, her life was about to change forever. The man she thought was a poor worker was actually a prince, and soon, the truth would be revealed in a way she never expected. Clara sat on the small wooden bed, staring at the flickering candlelight. The room was cold, and the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the window made her shiver. It had been months since she left Thomas and Margaret's house, and life had been nothing but a struggle. Edward worked hard every day, doing small jobs just so they could have something to eat. Though he was kind to her, Clara still felt lost. One evening, Edward came home looking different. His usual tired expression was gone, replaced with a calm and serious look. Clara noticed it right away. "Clara, I need to tell you something," Edward said, his voice steady. Clara looked up, confused. "What is it?" she asked softly. Edward took a deep breath and sat beside her. He reached for her hands, holding them gently. Clara could feel his hands were slightly trembling. "I haven't been completely honest with you," he began. "I am not the poor man you think I am." Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" Edward looked into her eyes. "Clara, I am a prince. My real name is Prince Edward of Eldoria. I disguised myself as a poor man to find a wife who would love me for who I am, not for my wealth or title." Clara blinked. She stared at Edward, trying to understand what he just said. "A prince," she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. Edward nodded. "Yes. My parents, the king and queen, have been waiting for me to return home. I wanted to tell you earlier, but I needed to be sure that you truly cared for me, not for riches or status." Clara shook her head, feeling dizzy. This is a joke, right?" she asked, laughing nervously. "You're telling me you're a prince?" "Edward, we live in a broken house. You've been working all day just to buy food. How can you be a prince?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper, laced with confusion and disbelief. The man she had struggled alongside, the one who toiled with her under the blazing sun and endured hunger without complaint. How could he be royalty? Edward exhaled slowly, his eyes filled with a calm, quiet sadness. Reaching into the worn pocket of his simple clothes, he pulled out a small object. It glinted faintly in the fading light. Clara squinted, her breath catching as she realized what it was: a ring. But not just any ring. Crafted from gleaming gold, delicate filigree surrounded a crest she recognized but never imagined she'd see up close: the royal family's crest. "This was given to me by my father," Edward said softly, holding the ring out so she could see it clearly. His eyes never left hers. "It's proof of who I am." Clara's hands flew to her mouth, trembling. Her wide eyes flicked from the ring to Edward's face, searching for any hint of a lie, a trick. But all she saw was sincerity. Raw, vulnerable truth. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring the world around her. You're serious?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Edward nodded gently, his expression steady, but his gaze tender. In that moment, Clara's knees felt weak, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. A flood of emotions rushed over her: shock, disbelief, relief, joy so fierce it felt almost painful. For so long, she had lived thinking life had passed her by, that she was destined to struggle forever. She had resigned herself to days filled with hardship and nights filled with silent tears. But standing before her now was not just the man she had loved and married despite his supposed poverty. It was a prince. Her prince. Overwhelmed, Clara broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Edward stepped forward without hesitation, gently cupping her face and wiping away her tears with his thumb. "Clara," he murmured, his voice full of warmth, "you've been so strong through everything. You never complained, no matter how hard life got. You kept going. You worked tirelessly. You loved without conditions. That's why I chose you. Not because of wealth or status but because of your heart." Her sobs softened, but the tears kept flowing freely. Edward leaned closer, pressing his forehead against hers. "I want to take you home now," he whispered. "To my real home. The palace." Clara stared at him, shaking her head slightly as if trying to wake from a dream. "Edward. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," he said with a soft smile. "Just trust me." Tears still streaming down her cheeks, Clara threw her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I thought my life was over. I thought I would struggle forever." Edward tightened his embrace, his voice firm yet gentle. "No, Clara. Your suffering ends today." The next morning felt like stepping into a completely different world. Edward led Clara, her hand clasped tightly in his, toward the grand palace gates. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she took in the towering walls, the polished stone, the guards in pristine uniforms. Every step felt surreal. As they neared the entrance, the guards' eyes widened before they bowed deeply, acknowledging Edward with respect. Clara could barely process it. This was real. It was happening. Inside, the palace glimmered with gold and marble, filled with grandeur she never imagined she'd witness. Soon, they stood before the king and queen themselves. Edward released Clara's hand briefly, bowing low. "Mother. Father," he said, his voice clear and proud. "I have returned. And I have brought my wife." The queen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, eyes shimmering with emotion. The king's brows lifted in shock. "Your wife?" he echoed, glancing between Edward and Clara. Edward reached back and took Clara's hand again, squeezing it gently. "Yes. This is Clara, the woman I chose." For a moment, there was silence. Then the queen stepped forward, her regal posture softening as she